Welcome to Between the Vines. My name's Kevin Martin. I'm here with Jennifer Phillips Russo. We're the Lake Erie Regional Grape Program of Pennsylvania State University and Cornell University. We wanted to bring you another update in the midst of the Lake Erie region's harvest season for Concord, which is when we get really busy. So I know a lot of our growers are hopefully driving around in circles most days, every day, making sure those vineyards are harvested this year. And one of the things we just wanted to update you on is a lot of diversity of how things are going during harvest, depending on which grower you talk to and where you're located. So maybe bring you some information because I know you're all stuck in your little corners of the world in your harvester, and bring you some information about how it's going across town and across counties and things like that. So Jen, I don't know if you wanted to start, but
Sure.
I know you had some weather data that you were looking at, and that was one of the things that's been varying from place to place.
I actually wanted to start off with, goggles and a snorkel and swimmies so that we could do this if anybody was watching it via video. We've had quite a bit of rain across the region since Friday. We were actually just looking at the total precipitation from Friday until this morning, and some are definitely getting hit harder than others. And keep in mind that this is not a newest station that is at every single acreage. It is just centrally located with some acres. So like Kevin, I know that you had an issue where it was raining about 150 feet away from a weather station and that weather station wasn't collecting the data. So this is
Well, the weather station was working, but yeah, if you walked over for a good, I mean, I didn't hang out there all day, but for a good 10 or 15 minutes, that storm was not moving at all.
craziness.
Mhm.
So there have been some of our stations in the network that were recording over 4 inches of rain just since Friday. With averaging, I don't have an average on here, but I would say average is probably 3 inches, maybe just under 3 inches of rain since Friday. So it is, by the way, Tuesday morning when we are recording this. So looking at just, let's see, Brant that's in an area between Buffalo and Silver Creek, had just over 4 inches of rain. Brockton heading down 20 in the gravel vines there, that was just 2.6 inches. Dunkirk had 2.7 inches. Fredonia was over 3 inches, 3.2. I mean, it's been crazy. Heading down towards Pennsylvania, Harbor Creek had almost 4 inches, 3.9. And the Northeast Lab had 3.6 inches. It's just a little bit wet out there, which I know can wreak havoc, not only on your machinery getting through your vines, but bins or gondolas filling up with rain as you're trying to harvest. It's a mess out there.
And, one of the other areas where I think there's been sort of some diversity based on location has been the ripening curve, and I'm sure almost entirely related to crop load. So it sounds like a lot of the processors have planned for some of this rain, which was pretty well forecasted, which is not unusual when there's 4 inches or 2.5 inches coming your way. So I know both of the Growers Co-op and National Grape shut down for at least a day to do cleanup, specifically targeting the rain, because there is, I've seen some pretty high bricks here and there, but there's also it sounds like some people either waiting, or at least they're certainly not picking in the rain, or they're not picking their heaviest stuff right now. They're strategically picking and harvesting, waiting for sugar accumulation to continue.
A little concerned about dilution there.
Oh, for sure, for sure. And I think like you've seen in Pennsylvania, it seems like the crop loads are pretty high where there was frost last year, which just makes sense.
Makes sense, right?
But yeah, it's not a showing up at the plant yet. If you just look at numbers, whether you look at Growers Co-op or um, uh, National Grape, because they've sort of strategically kind of avoided harvesting some of those grapes. Plant averages are all above 16, so nobody's yet rolling the dice on things that are very close 15 to 15.0 very often. And I don't know if all of our growers know how paper blending works at Growers Co-op, but it's likely that their minimum standard will be 15 this year. So I think they're planning on that as growers or as individual growers are trying to reach that 15 bricks before they start harvesting. At least that's what it looks like based on the data.
And I haven't heard anything from the processors individually to confirm that or not, but
Well, so yeah, I mean, so the way paper blending works with growers co-op is it's going to be based on what other growers and what the plant average ends up being, and it's sort of a deviation from that. And there's I think, a reasonable chance that that standard will be above 15. But when it is above 15, 15 becomes the lesser standard to make sure that they don't accidentally have a statistically high bricks year where some grower has to reach bricks higher than what they actually need to reach or to market the product. So I would anticipate that growers, the individual harvesters themselves, are concerned about needing to reach 15 bricks this year because, like I said, we're seeing a lot of areas that have fairly high bricks.
right.
The plant averages are all above 16, at least from the plants that I've seen. I don't think everybody's open yet, so we don't know what their plant averages are if they haven't opened. And there was a couple of facilities for wine that opened up before the 18th of September, like the week of the 11th. They're obviously not very concerned with bricks. That's not what they're going for. So I would imagine that their average bricks are lower, but that's not the point. So that's fine. You look at it, looked like even Niagara grapes were fairly sweet this year. Most people, I think, averaged over 14, which, because of the early harvest, that's about as much as you would expect, I would think. So I don't think there was a lot of diversity that comes out in that average. I mean, maybe there was a grower here and there that had 12 bricks, but that's a pretty high average for Niagaras.
Well, and most of the growing season the weather was just beautiful.
Right.
Just beautiful. And people did a really good job with their spray programs this year. And I know that having that bright sun was helpful as well, but hearing that canopies had stayed cleaned, even the ones that had like Cadillac spray programs were just starting to see powdery buildup because of all this rain in some vineyards. So
yeah, I mean, the things that were clean, I haven't seen any disease in. I I think I definitely see a lot of grape berry moth.
Yes, I see that as well. I have seen a lot of powdery and downy, but again, those were in some vineyards where spray intervals just got away from people and also some product might be slipping. So,
Right. Yeah, I would imagine you'd have to have sort of a compound of factors this year. If you were seeing that in Concord, particularly downy mildew, I wouldn't
no,
expect to see any downy.
no, not.
But yes, I mean it was a year of variability. So in vinifera, sure, if you miss something, or even in Niagara's, if you miss something or use the wrong product, there was enough rain later in the season so that you definitely could have had some issues with your leaves for sure.
Not just rain, but there were some times with just high humidity without
Yeah.
rain for
Mhm.
I almost said doors on end, days on end.
Yeah.
So that as well.
But I think for the most part, what I saw in Concord, and hopefully all of our growers that listen to this, sort of followed this path of, look, prices are really high. There hasn't been a substantial change in the cost of materials for fungicides or even insecticides. If anything, those prices are lower. So, let's do a little bit of IPM, but let's also go nuts. Like if we scout and we see something, we can target it and we can spend money to target it. And that's, again, not to say that IPM is a bad thing, but it is to say, like, if you start to see stuff or you start to be concerned about things, you can use a better material, which may also be a little more IPM friendly. And so I think we did see a lot of that.
I agree.
But not 100% of the acreage for sure. So for the most part, I think things are clean. I see, just driving around, I still see, well, I won't see it now, but 2 weeks ago, I think I saw a lot of copper that was still on the leaves. So that's a good way to, That's a nice insurance policy that might not necessarily be IPM, where you don't necessarily think you need to keep your leaves healthy for this year, but maybe you want to lower inoculum for next year. Saw it in a lot of vineyards where yields are probably less than 6 tons to the acre. So I don't think they were worried about ripening.
No, I did recommend it to a couple growers as well, just for eradicant.
So yeah, I mean, I think that this was a year where, uh, you know, it growers were investing in that disease control for sure. So I didn't see very much. And the growers that are going to harvest late, I think they're going to need it, not necessarily for powdery, but like I said, I'm seeing grape berry moth. I think the where grape berry moth hit earlier than August 5th. I mean, there's what looks like secondary rots that are taking over about half of some of the clusters, and how many clusters. I think that really depends on the site. So, if you're marketing to a processor that hasn't opened yet, or you're in a situation where you haven't delivered a load yet because of low bricks, uh, it's going to be a bit of a struggle, because that damage, I think, continues to compound as time goes on.
I
And
agree.
and particularly, I think, when your bricks are higher. So if you're not harvesting because your processor isn't open, or if all of your stuff is going to eventually hit 15 bricks in 2 weeks or in a week, that's going to make it more difficult, because there will be time where they are at a higher level of bricks and just getting damaged. But I think this is an important reminder that we can sort of try to manage for this diversity at harvest time. Um, I know a lot of growers are very apprehensive about fruit thinning, and a lot of growers sort of only deliver to one processor, and those two things are both increase the risk of some of these problems that occur. Um, Having a diversity in where you deliver your grapes allows you to produce a more diverse crop and harvest it at a wider range. Like, harvesters or processors never open up on the same day. When crops are light, a harvest should be 4.5 weeks long, but we're, you know, let's see, how far along are we?
Wait, we're 2 weeks into it, 10 days?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
so you could be harvesting for 2 weeks before one of your processors even opens. So you could end up with a 7 week harvest on a short year if you deliver to enough places. That's not always the most popular thing to advertise, but it does allow you to have a lot of flexibility in your operations, so that you're not trying to harvest 7 loads a day, or you're not trying to make sure everything reaches 15 bricks on September 27th.
And you're not
Uh,
having a lot of shelling if there's a lot of berry moth pressure.
right.
That
And
does
this
not.
was a good year. I mean, I think some growers could have, I mean, sort of my philosophy on thinning is, um, there is no magic number for what your crop load should be. There's a magic number for each particular year, but we don't know exactly what's going to happen between 30 days post bloom and harvest. So to vary that crop load a little bit, trying to target, like, what are you going to harvest the first week versus what are you going to harvest the last week? Uh, I think in an ideal world, from a viticultural perspective, you would say we probably want everything to be ripe 32 days after veraison, right? Like, because that's going to give the plant, the grape plant, the opportunity to do its thing and to set yourself up for next year. But if you can't do that with 100% of your acreage, you could do it with 25% of your acreage.
Right.
And then if things go better than expected in the post veraison world, your 100% of your vineyard can do its thing. And if things go worse than expected, at least 25% of your acreage is still set up for a good year next year. And you have something to do that first week of harvest, because 25% of your acreage is going to be right. And I think as extension, we're a big proponent of trying to control risk. But one of the things we can do is also, have different levels of risk in different blocks. And that's one way to allow for more risk without things getting out of hand. Like, I would say they did last year. I know growers had a very good year. It was a very successful year. But before all of that happened, before November, in hindsight was 2020, looking at that from the perspective of September 27th, 2021, it was a just unnecessarily scary time.
Through November
And
9th, wasn't it? Oh my
right.
goodness.
And we're seeing, I'm seeing in the vineyard lower tonnage that will never and never did get harvested. So, just not a hypothetical example, just like an actual example that doesn't apply to everybody. It's 15 tons to the acre. 3 tons fell off in October and November. So there was only 12 that were harvested. And now there's 4 ton to the acre. And that probably would have been at least 6 if those 3 tons that just fell on the ground anyway had been thinned off.
Thinned off, they could have
And
been.
right. So you would have had the cost of thinning, but there would have been no grape cost or yield cost to thinning because they fell off anyway. And I think there was a lot of that last year. And I think growers recognize that, but it is very difficult to make that decision 30 days post bloom and actually
Absolutely,
make that
especially
decision.
when the market was as high as it was for the past decades last year. I get it. But this year you're right. And now we're seeing lower yields because of those higher tonnage that shelled a lot.
Right.
Where they
Well,
might be higher this year had they thinned.
When things are that crazy, it's a little bit of a leap, price wise, it's a little bit of a leap to say it's definitely worth it to thin. I mean, there were some pressures last year to not thin. Things looked like they were ripening pretty normally. We were spoiled by 4 or 5 excellent post veraison falls, late summers in a row. Last year was not great. It wasn't ideal. So I think growers were sort of planning on the ideal and hoping that they could, just get 10, 12, 15 ton to the acre at $400 a ton. And thinning off a ton last year, there was no guarantee that prices were going to be high this year. So you could be losing a $400 a ton grape and replacing it with a $200 a ton grape theoretically. And so yeah, there was a lot of pressure to not thin, which is why I go back to that. But what if you just thinned, say, 25% of your acreage and you controlled that risk? Because what I think growers could have said pretty easily 30 days post bloom is, there is no way I'm going to have issues the first 5 days of harvest. Like, there is no way that this is going to be easy the first week. Maybe they're thinking, yeah, I'm going to be fine because weeks, what ended up being 2 through 6, I'm going to be ripe for those weeks. But there would have been a real yield advantage to being able to harvest that first week. And
you did recommend that.
I think I may have said exactly that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know that I had said that. 2 parts of your acreage.
Right. And, we're seeing a little bit of that this year. I don't have a great solution, but when you really roll the dice and you give yourself a yield that's that out of place with your vine size, we're seeing some pretty small vines this year in certain locations. There's a lot of variability, but in certain locations, small vines and small crop. And thinning doesn't work very well to increase that vine size once it can't even maintain a small crop.
So you just gave me like a great segue to plug for people to get out there, where your variation is, and especially pay attention to it this year as you're harvesting and what your tonnage is going out. Note those areas. You can even use the MyEV tool to mark it on that platform as to where they're lower and where they're higher so that you can go back and take pruning weights this year. Take a couple, you don't have to take pruning weights for your entire acreage, just go to your spots that are representative of, this 60% of our tonnage was this. Let's take some vines in those areas and take some pruning weights to kind of watch that and know what your vine size is for next year.
And if you start to see pruning weights that are well below 2 pounds, that's sort of when you have to adjust crop yield at pruning time, which is not a strategy that we necessarily universally recommend. Like, the idea is to leave up too much and thin it later, right?
Yeah, to frost and freeze. But if you need to build your vine size up.
Right. To build it up from 2 pounds to 3 pounds, you can do that through fruit thinning. But to build it up from 1 to 2, it can be problematic. And I think it's probably just a mechanical struggle. Like, if you did your thinning by hand, maybe it would work. But but it doesn't seem to work particularly well for very small vines and very small crops. So you've got to do it when you prune, which is, I know it's difficult this now because you have to tell your pruning crews to prune differentially in a block, which they're not going to do on a vine by vine basis anymore. They're going to, you guys know, they're going to look at a small vine and say, look, I already pruned that one, and not prune anything off of it. And then if there's one big vine in that lousy block, they're going to prune it like crazy because it's big. So, this is actually where I think mechanized pruning has an advantage, and you're able to sort of manually differentially prune probably better than a crew can. And if you get a crew that can do it differentially, at least within that block, like just scale that entire block back to 80 buds. That's probably something that some blocks are going to need next year, even though it's going to make for a smaller crop. And again, don't do it to 100% of your acreage. Do it to a percentage of whatever needs to be done, or all of whatever needs to be done, depending on what your situation is. If you have one 10-acre block out of 200 that just has 1 pound vines, you can fix that in a year. If you have 100 acres and they all have 0.8 pound vines, then maybe you just do a percentage. But that's really, I think that's what it takes. Is it's got to be done at pruning time when they really get taxed like that, or it just takes so many years
to bring it back. Right.
Yeah, I mean, it takes luck, right? Like,
yeah,
oh, things weren't as fruitful, and we had a great growing season, and I think we saw a little bit of that in some of the experiments where Dr. Bates really pushes things to the point of unreasonableness for the purpose of science, right? Like if he's trying to draw a C in a vineyard that could show up from outer space, or he's trying to get the pH below 4, which we don't have results from that yet, but that's going to be another area where I think you'll see vine size where the traditional method of just taking off 3 tons of fruit is not as effective. So if we come up with better ways to do it, we'll certainly let you know.
Well, absolutely. Sort of the point of being here.
Yeah, there's no formal research into that right now, but I can see where, if we have problematic areas in a vineyard block, we have, staff that's going to be looking for creative solutions to fix those problems. So, our vineyards are just like your vineyards in that sense sometimes.
Well, that could be a plug for our advisory committee. As a grower out there wanting some sort of research or always having a question about, please consider being a part of our advisory committee, where we meet usually at least twice a year to discuss what our growers need, what you want us to look into, what you need programming on. So contact us here at the office if you're interested.
Yes, absolutely. And, this is definitely becoming a very difficult year. And I don't think it was back in July, but a very difficult year as a educator to try to discuss what's going on in vineyards, because like I said at the beginning of the podcast, things are very different from vineyard to vineyard right now in terms of what we're seeing in yields and vine size and crop load. I'm hearing a lot of reports of bricks under 14, but then I'm looking at plant averages of 16.2, 16.5, which, makes sense, because those grapes just aren't being harvested. So it just doesn't show up. But obviously there's some high bricks out there. If there's, thousands of tons being harvested in the first couple of days above 16. So.
Right. And it's a type of variability. Some of those are just bigger vines. Some of those are vines that froze last year. There's a lot of different reasons for all of that.
Right. And we have some reports of how bad those yields are that are yielding bricks like that. But that's variable as well. So we will certainly know more when those higher brick blocks just run out of grapes, because certainly some growers are just covering tons and tons of acreage right now. Right. And others are a little more moderate, so I think it just depends a lot. There's some 6-7 ton yields out there that are yielding 16 bricks, but there's also a whole bunch of stuff that's 2-3 tons to the acre, and trying to quantify How much of each is pretty challenging right now as we, continue to be sort of frustrated by variable effects. Like you did all that crop estimation in July, and I think this rainfall will probably improve some of the yields that were predicted
Right.
because we should see above average berry size, I would think. I mean, it'll be interesting to see that one more week of data, which we don't have on that berry curve. But now that we've had all this rain, we'll see if either berry size goes up or if it sort of reached capacity and they start splitting, or combination of both.
They were on their way to plateauing this last week, so we'll see what happens.
Right. So once they reach that plateau, though, that it sort of looks like a tail, but that tail can kind of wag, right?
Yeah.
Don't laugh at me. This is not my joke. I think Terry's told it 2 or 3 times, so I can't take any credit.
Yes, that tail can definitely wag.
Right. And so that's, as I recall, that's easily a couple of tenths, 3 tenths on the berry curve, which is, 10% of your crop, one direction or the other. So we'll see in Northeast where things might be a little overcropped in some vineyards. We'll probably have to wait for that dilution to go away. So that you may not realize that 10%.
Because they're the ones with higher rainfall as well. So
Yes,
we'll
so
see.
that should be challenging. That was I think we got reminded of that last year when weather was favorable in the sense that it didn't get cold and the rain wouldn't stop, the berries wouldn't dehydrate either. Like this is not a day length thing.
Right. Just looking outside again, it's still raining here. It's
Yes.
still raining
Yeah.
here in Portland, New York.
I think that's all we have this week. I know everyone is very busy harvesting, but if you are on your telephones and you want to contact us that way and suggest more topics for podcasts, please feel free. You can continue to text and email as always. We don't necessarily expect it this time of year, but if you want to, you're more than welcome. And we'll be back. We'll be back next week. And thank you all for joining us. Anything from you, Jen?
Yeah, just be safe out there, and we'll see y'all next week.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot. See you next week.
Bye, everyone.